that feeling of trying to prove yourself, but you're not really sure who the judges are? Or you're trying to earn a place when the scenery, though, is constantly changing. Or you're running after expectations, but it feels like the expectations can run a little faster than you. We try to prove ourselves. We try to earn a place in the world. We try to solidify our credentials. We try to prove that we're competent, that we're lovable, that we're powerful, that we're right and good and worthy. We try to earn respect and security, and we try and earn authority. We try to earn love. And then we try to substantiate it all for as long as possible. Maybe in writing, maybe on a cute little plaque of some sort. Earning and proving. We have formal things in our lives. We've got like tests and interviews and degree programs. Even dating, actually, is like that. And then we have this emotional pattern. And the emotional pattern extends really deeply into our psyches. You have to prove yourself and earn your place and substantiate your credentials. It's an emotional pattern. Prove and earn, and substantiate. We impose it on ourselves. We impose it on others. Prove and earn and substantiate. It's an emotional pattern that can be exhausting. It can also be very disappointing and sometimes devastating when our proving becomes failing, or when our earning becomes losing, or when our substantiation becomes falling apart. But what if it were backwards? What if it were all flipped? What if there was not proving or earning, but what if instead it was more like receiving and then empowerment? I mean, we have this exhausting emotional pattern, but there's also a much deeper and very, very different spiritual pattern. God rejects the proving and the earning and the substantiating. God rejects it. God calls first. God names unequivocally. God bestows overwhelmingly. God opens roles surprisingly, and then God tests. It's a deep spiritual pattern. We see it throughout all the ancient stories and scriptures. God calls, and then God tests. God calls, and then God prepares. God calls, and then God equips and empowers. God calls, and then God teaches us deeply what that calling means. We have to resist our emotional pattern of proving, earning, and substantiating to hear God's calling, and then to be ready for God's testing. And that test, God's testing, it's not at all what we normally think of as testing. God's tests aren't exams of performance or fact recollection. God's tests are more like a very challenging and very disrupting guidance. God calls and then disrupts us into righteousness. God calls and then challenges us into fruit bearing. For example, you are a healer, God calls. God calls you a healer and then says, now, let me show you how to cry with people who are dying. Let me show you how to heal the things that need healing with my power. Oh, here comes the Amtrak. I love that train. That's one of my favorites. So pretty, full of people going somewhere nice. God calls, and then God disrupts into God's power. God calls you a leader. God calls. You're a leader. Now, let me strip away all of your power so that you will lead only by my Spirit. You are free. God calls you free. God calls. You are free. Now, let me show you the fruit that can be born out of freedom, and let me teach you this wild dance of reconciliation through hatred. God calls and then disrupts us into God's power. So God will call you a parent. You are a parent. Now let me show you how to receive love and be a conduit of love when you are absolutely empty. God calls you an instrument of harmony. God calls. Now, let me show you how to dwell in the midst of violent dissonance. God calls. You are an adopted child. You are my adopted child. And then God says, let me show you how to navigate the desert. There is this calling, and then there is this test. It's no proving yourself, no earning a place in this world, no substantiating your credentials, just receiving the call. And then comes the disrupting and challenging guidance that teaches you what that calling means. We have to resist our emotional pattern in order to embrace God's calling and then to truly experience the test. The ancient Hebrew word is nasa. And there are a lot of these stories that help us recognize the spiritual pattern, the calling, and then the nasa, the test. Abram, for example, who becomes Abraham, this guy is called a nation. But this is long before he even has a child. He is called, and then he's pulled through this wild journey, this nasa, through deserts and famines and violence and sacrifice and deception. And it's not that he earns any status first. He doesn't pass a tryout. He is called, and then he is disrupted and challenged closer and closer into God's power. His tests teach him his calling. Then you have the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people are called out of enslavement in Egypt. They don't earn liberation. They don't fight their way out. They are called out. And then they spend 40 years in the desert. The nasa, wandering, being tested, being disrupted and challenged closer and closer into God's power. And in their tests, they learn how to understand what it means to be called the people of the word. The test, the nasa. It is inevitable when there is calling. The test always comes, and it always teaches us what our true calling is. It always points back to the calling. You are adopted by God. You are a conduit of God's blessing. Wow, I mean, it's amazing. Calls are fabulous, but they're hard to understand. And it's easy to misunderstand. It's easy to get distracted. It's easy to lose our way. It's easy to get weary or lonely or afraid. It's easy to become self-absorbed. The test pulls us back into the calling. The test teaches us the meaning of the calling. This exact same thing, this exact same spiritual pattern happens to the early followers of Jesus. The calling and then the test that teaches the calling. Peter, for example, Peter is called into leadership, and certainly he does not deserve it. Peter, of all folks, does not deserve it. And he immediately, being called a leader, he immediately has some ideas about what he's going to do with that calling. He has some ideas about Jesus and what Jesus should be doing. And then Peter has the dark night of his soul. Peter plunges into humiliation. He is overwhelmed by powerlessness, disappointment, and horror when a little girl asks him if he knows Jesus. This is Peter. And a little girl says she thinks that Peter is one of the followers of that arrested Galilean man on trial. And Peter, the brave leader, completely falls apart. He denies, and then my stilted translation of Mark's account is he threw himself down into tears. Oh, Peter. Oh, Peter. He is disrupted, and he is challenged, and he is tested back into his true calling, which is the rock on which Jesus was building his church. Calling in the test. The same spiritual pattern happens with Paul. Paul the murderer. Paul the violent hunter of Christian families. He's rocking this like the cool Hebrew name Saul, and he's got all these fancy letters. And he meets Jesus miraculously on the road to Damascus. And there he is called to be an apostle. Not an apostle of death and terror. He is called to be an apostle of new life and a gospel that crosses cultural barriers. Jesus calls him an apostle, a sent one. And Paul has done the opposite of earn it. He has persecuted the church. Blood is on his hands. But he is called. And who knows what he thought this call meant? I mean, how could he have a clue? He was a blue-blooded Pharisee with a great name, the best rabbi, all of the letters. How could he understand his calling? So then, Paul is tested. He's blind. He's lost. He can't eat for days. He's utterly dependent on the prayers of others. And then he's hunted, just as he was a hunter, and he escapes the city in a little basket, and he wanders Arabia for years. For years. The same places maybe that the Hebrew people wandered. Paul recounts a lot of this in his letter to the Galatians. Talk about a test. And finally, Barnabas goes and finds him after Paul has wandered back to his hometown. What does it mean to be an apostle, Paul? What does your unearned calling mean, Paul? How did this many-year disruption and challenge and test teach you a deeper understanding of your calling, Paul, which is the apostle, the sent one, the ocean and continent crosser, the cultural translator, the prison cell writer on which Jesus was building his church? You have a calling. God has a specific calling for your life. And therefore, you will be tested. The Nasa will come. So let me really quickly name our immediate tension with this. Tests are not for passing. Tests are for seeing truly your calling. You want to pass, but God wants you to see and hear. Emotionally, we want to prove, we want to earn, we want to substantiate, and that is not what God's tests are for. Peter didn't pass his test. Paul didn't either. Even with a hefty curve, we are not going to even make a low C because God doesn't care about grades or passing or proving or earning or substantiation. God cares about you seeing and hearing your calling. It's mystery and it's beauty, but there's some practicality too. Matthew and Luke give us this marvelous model for this. They both, Matthew and Luke, both tell us that immediately after Jesus was baptized, he audibly hears his calling, "You are my beloved son." And when there is a calling, there is testing. So Jesus is immediately driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. And Matthew and Luke give us this model for responding to all of the forms in which the tests come at us. All of these various tests hit Jesus, and Jesus doesn't pass the tests. Jesus transforms the tests. He doesn't pass. He uncovers, he unveils a clearer, more robust vision of what it means to be called a beloved child. So Matthew and Luke, they let us see the different ways these tests will come at us, and we see how Jesus transforms that test into seeing and hearing truly the calling. And we're gonna take a closer look at all of these forms in these coming weeks. We'll look at each one individually. You have been called, and you will be tested. You've already been tested, and you will be tested again. You actually may be in the middle of a really intense test right now. Or, you also might feel some serious guilt and shame about past failures or current failures. What do you hope for? I mean, do you hope that you're going to pass? Or do you hope that you will be led into a deep and full seeing and hearing of your true calling? Imagine that experience. Imagine the experience of God's voice and breath over you. The disruption and the challenge and the testing, they are all there to carry you back into God's calling over you. They're there to carry you back. Let me end by a really, really quick story. I was a little boy, but I was big enough to know like shame and embarrassment. And I woke up in the middle of the night crying really hard. I had a terrible nightmare, and I was crying out. I was sobbing. I was covered in sweat in my favorite Batman pajamas. And in that dark room, my dad came in. I remember him calming me down, and he was putting me back to sleep by rubbing my back. And he was singing a song that his mother sang to him as a little boy. And she grew up in India, so I didn't even understand what the words were. But I listened and I felt this song in, I think, a northern Indian language. I couldn't understand, but I could hear. It's like a calling. You are mine. This is what I was hearing. You are mine. I am here for you. I will always be here for you. Can you feel that place of powerlessness? It's that place of humiliation, that place of being tested. And I guess really what I want to say, or what I want to ask is, can you feel that the test is just pulling you back? It's just comforting you back into God's voice and God's calling.